Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Fitness Education Series produced by the Australian Fitness Academy. It's like progressive overload for your brain. I'm your host, Tom Rock, and today's episode we're going to follow on and move into our maybe 2 or 3 episode, we'll see how we go, series on programming that I alluded to last week. So if you haven't listened to last week's episode, it's a relatively quick one. Jump on, have a listen. If you do have any questions or comments about programming, feel free to leave them in that, leave a comment or send me an email over these next few weeks, and I will make sure I get to all your programming questions. So thank you to all those who sent through emails. Great to get some opinions and thoughts and ideas and hear what you guys are thinking. So we're going to delve into it, and hopefully throughout this series of or this topic, we answer some of your questions, but you also get an idea about how I go about programming or coming up with structure or narrowing something down. And programming doesn't always have to be complicated. You can simplify it as much as you want, depending on goals, a client's training history, their ability, how long they've been training for, their training status, all that sort of thing, how fit they are. And it doesn't have to be complicated. That's the best thing about, I think, creating programs for different clients or different individuals. Really simple programs can work really well if someone is wanting something maybe a bit more stimulating, or they just get bored. Creating more interesting style programs with a bit more complexity can be good too, but it's not always necessary. But if people enjoy it and it keeps them consistent and they like it, there's nothing wrong with it either. So we're going to have a look at building a bit of a program today, and we'll start off today looking at general structure. And we're going to work on a longer term plan because I think it allows us to develop the conversation a little bit more. And then sort of through the next couple of weeks, we'll work on narrowing it down to a weekly structure and then a session structure as well, and how we manage moving through different phases of a program. So I'll bring up a bit of a spreadsheet and a program look in a second, but I think it's important to understand this will be different for everybody. So this structure and these phases of these programs will be different depending on what a goal is, how long a person has to train for, and how often you want to break up blocks, but also like if they have a specific event they're training for. So it could be like it could be a marathon, it could be a fun run, it could be something like a wedding, for example, which is an example we might look at today, is getting fit for your wedding, a bit of a fun one, but it could be anything. And that's where I think it's important to have, if the client doesn't have a long-term goal, their goal is I just want to get fitter and healthier, that's great. And it's important for you as a coach or a personal trainer to really develop what you want the focus to be for each training block, or the training program as a whole. If it's 10 weeks, 12 weeks, if it's 6 months, whatever it is, whatever phase you go through, having a different goal for each phase is important so you can track progress and give them objective data that shows they're improving and that program is working. If a program is general fitness, it's great, but we want to narrow that down a little bit more as a trainer to make sure we can actually develop a program. And if a client doesn't want general fitness, well, how do we sort of go about that? So I think, yeah, we'll discuss that, and we'll look at a client who's looking to get ready for a wedding or get fit for their wedding. And I'll bring up the program now. So I've sort of started hashing it out a little bit here. So what we'll do is I'll just have a little bit of a look. So we've just gone for a random 30-week sort of plan, broken into blocks and phases, and they're just 5-week blocks. So again, there's no rule. It could be 4 weeks, it could be 6 weeks. There's many different ways to sort of periodize and long-term plan. And it's up to you about how you go about this, but it allows you to develop focus later on and really plan what that session entails, which is what we'll get to over the next couple of weeks. But for this plan, let's say we're working on general fitness. it's going to be a combination of probably cardiovascular training and resistance training. And that first decision you're going to have to make is, well, do I do resistance and cardio in the same session, or I do my resistance sessions separately to my cardiovascular sessions? How long does my client have to train? How often they can train? And these are all questions we need answers to create a program for anybody. And this is why individualized programs are so important. So as we work through this a client example, we'll put in place some rules about what they can and can't do, or what their availability is like as we get closer and we look to structure the weeks. But having those thoughts about, well, if they can only train for 45 minutes or an hour at a time, fitting resistance and cardio in the same session might be tough. So we may look at splitting that up. And then we're essentially writing two programs. We're going to write a resistance program, and we've got to write a cardiovascular program. And then we've got to structure those over a week. So how we split that time, what our focus is for each of those programs is important to eventually come to. And that's what we'll look at. But that's really easy to do once we have the overarching focus. So in terms of this, I've created 5-week blocks. So we can see here, block 1, ease in, build a base, potentially coming back from a little bit of a cruisy training period or not training too much. So we just want to get an idea of potentially just build some consistency, get back into some routines. Probably maybe it could be work on mobility, it could be find out what they currently lift, what's their 1RMs, what exercise do they like, do they dislike, what exercise suit them, all sorts of things can be done in this first 5 weeks. And then we've just sort of given a bit of a different focus to each different 5-week block. So we've got a sort of a hypertrophy focused block, and then we move more into a bit of a strength focused block, potentially just to change up the stimulus a little bit, keep things interesting. Again, this might not be necessary for any client. It could be something they're interested in, what they like doing, but potentially just changing the rep range here, and obviously higher intensity or weight. But maybe we change a few exercises here too, and we can look at that when we narrow it down in the later week podcast. Then we might go into block 3. I've got, again, back to hypertrophy, but maybe more of an upper body focus in this stage. But that could change depending on clients. Could be lower body. It could be more strength. It could be power. It could be depending on the goal. It could be a whole range of things. Could be a cardiovascular focus if they're moving towards a fun run. We sort of strip back the resistance and up the cardio. But again, it depends on the goals. Then we got a block 5 where the goal is to lean out. And yeah, so that's going to create we need to get a kilojoule deficit for that. So that's, again, we're going to have to write our resistance and cardio programs for that, but also take into account that that's when we want to start focusing on a kilojoule deficit. And then we move into block 6 where we continue a bit of a deficit and then look to build into the competition, or in this case, a wedding, for example, and probably a bit of kilojoules back up, get comfy, feel good, and get ready for that. So that's just the initial way I look to create a program. This is a long-term example, but even if you've got, say, 2 blocks, you're working with, or even 3 blocks, 15 weeks, how are you going to build that? And if a client says general fitness, and we're doing a combination of resistance and cardio, which this example will end up being, we'll want to just do it. You might have different goals, but these goals are going to allow us to program what we do each week. So how I program each day, each week here, and then hypertrophy, what am I going to do differently? And then strength, how's my strength weeks going to look different to these weeks? This is how we talk about long-term programming, and having these blocks set up with these sort of mesocycle goals is how we're going to structure our program. If we don't really have those overarching goals, it's harder to plan what I do week to week in terms of exercise selection, frequency of resistance versus cardio, all that sort of thing. So this is where I'm going to start, I guess, my programming design. And from here, I'll narrow in. I go, okay, so I've got this block to ease in and build a base and get an idea of potentially what my client can do, what they can't do, what I need to work on before we really attack a program head on. And that's over these 5 weeks. So how am I going to structure? What am I going to do on the 5-7 days of the week? What am I going to program for them to complete? That's all something we want to come up with. And we're going to look at that next week in our podcast. But this week, I just want to touch on that idea of sort of giving a goal to each block. And then that's going to let you come down and go, okay, so what am I going to do each day? So then it's going to, how do I split my resistance versus cardio? And then you've got to look at, okay, exercise selection. How am I doing that? And that all comes down to frequency, how often, how long someone can train for. So they're all conversations you need to have with your client. But initially, it's good to have a plan in place. I think the plan, it's not always necessary to have a long-term plan and periodize every single program, but it allows you to really target what your program is. So even if I'm just working on one block, for example, and we just look at even just a hypertrophy block, we got a 5-week block here of hypertrophy. I need to know what that is in order to create a program. If a client just comes in and says, oh, I want to train, I want to get fitter, well, what does the program look like and what does it need to entail? I need to sort of develop a consistent 5-week program. I need to know what days they can train, how long they can train for, and what their goals are, what exercises they can do, what they can't do, what their exercise preferences are, all these things to start to tailor down what an actual session looks like. So generally when I come to programming, it starts with this broad view of what I want to achieve, and hopefully we'll get towards the client's goal by whatever time period they have. And then I can sort of narrow down session by session what they're going to look to do. But yeah, first introductory session on or podcast on the programming in the programming series, guys. So to help you, that gives you a bit of an overarching idea of where we're heading with this. If it's prompting some thoughts, that's great. Send an email to tom@afa.com.au if you have any questions at this stage or moving forward. You have any questions about how you apply things or session by session, or your frequency or your training split, cardio resistance, one session, do you fit in one session, do you separate sessions? Anything you got, guys, that you want me to touch on going forward, send an email to tom@afa.com.au or post a comment in the podcast, under the podcast as well. So yeah, bit of a start to where we're going, guys. So next week, we're going to start to look at probably building out a block, how we go. We'll plan some sessions. We'll look at weekly structure and then exercise selection based on that structure and how a client or a client's time availability will work. And then we'll look at how that progresses sort of week to week or block to block, what we might look to change once we have that initial structure. But yeah, again, send your thoughts through, guys. Look forward to hearing from you. If you've got anything you want me to cover or touch on, email me. Other than that, guys, have a great weekend and I'll talk to you all soon.